Action talk and no one bag of mouth. Boom. Padang, padang.
morning all. We're about to get our session started and the presentation this morning, which is a public lecture. So good morning all governors, deputy governors, and all our distinguished guests, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Alan and I'm a representative from the research department at the Central Bank of the Bahamas. And over the last 3 days, my colleagues and I have had the honor of co-hosting with the Caribbean Economic Research Team the 53rd Annual Monetary Studies Conference under the theme Economic Growth and Resilience, Post-Pandemic Policies for Sustainable Recovery in Small Open Economies. Albeit virtual, we had the opportunity to hear from respected scholars throughout the region on a broad range of topics that are timely and thought-provoking. And as we observe countries all over the world navigating their various recovery strategies from the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, rising inflation, and the intensifying threat of climate change, in our deliberations, we considered the micro and the macroeconomic impacts of the pandemic on our economies and the best course of action for rebuilding policy space. We also discussed optimal monetary and fiscal buffers for mitigating climate change risks and delved briefly into the digital space as we discoursed on central bank digital currency and financial inclusion. Perhaps the principal takeaway for me was that while recovering our small open economies will require innovative and robust policy responses that cater to the individual needs of our countries, it was equally important for continued collaborative discourses like the one offered by the Annual Monetary Studies Conference, where we can collectively brainstorm new ideas to address the myriad of challenges we all share, from constrained fiscal space, high debt, and susceptibility to climate events to social challenges in education and crime. That is the true spirit of regionalism, and there is much to be said about what we can achieve as a region. And so, it is really quite fitting that this morning we're honoring Dr. Adlith Brown with this memorial lecture, as she too was a regionalist. And as a true economic theorist, who reveled in the realms of ideas, she understood that real policy change requires dynamic thinking that shifts paradigms. Over the years, the keynote speakers of this lecture have embodied those same qualities, and this year is no exception. Dr. Jean Leon, president of the Caribbean Development Bank, is an esteemed thought leader, having worked with the International Monetary Fund for more than 24 years, covering the African region as well as the Bahamas and Jamaica. Prior to that, he served as the Director of Research at the Central Bank of Barbados and taught as an associate professor at the State University of New York. He has taken to world stage in recent months with his dynamic work at the CDB, which has a specific emphasis on the development of small island development states, particularly in the aftermath of an exogenous shock, and the role that the multilateral community can play in assessing and meeting those needs. With that said, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 35th Adlith Brown Memorial Lecture, a linchpin of the annual monetary conference, and I look forward to yet another insightful presentation from Dr. Leon, who will be speaking on supporting the Caribbean region's post-pandemic recovery. Please welcome him to the podium.
Good morning, governors. I dare say it feels very much at home, seeing a lot of faces that I used to meet at Regional Program of Monetary Studies, and maybe listening to the Adlith Brown Memorial Lectures over the years. But first, distinguished guests, of course, those of us who are here and equally online. Let me begin by saying first a warm welcome to you, and to indicate that it is a great privilege for me to have been asked to deliver the 35th Adlith Brown Memorial Lecture. Dr. Adlith Stefana Brown distinguished herself as a gifted academic and economic theorist who reveled in the realm of ideas to help overcome the region's most pressing development challenges. Over the years, this seminar has remained true to her legacy and has become a showcase of Caribbean excellence and thought leadership that has featured many distinguished regional scholars and policymakers. The theme of this year's lecture, supporting the region's post-pandemic recovery, is both critical and urgent. The COVID-19 pandemic represented an unprecedented shock to the economic, social, and institutional landscape of all regional economies. The pandemic plunged the Caribbean into an even deeper recession than the 2008-2009 global financial crisis and exacerbated pre-existing structural vulnerabilities. While some economies have started to recover, momentum has slowed as the fallout from the Russia-Ukraine war has heightened food and energy security issues, increased international and domestic prices, widened income and gender inequalities, and slowed economic activity in several of our major trading partners. Additionally, not only are our countries among the most vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, they are also among the least resilient in the world, which lengthens the duration of recovery from shocks. These existing and emerging threats are encroaching at a time when governments have fewer financial resources for infrastructure and social investment, which will most likely result in delays in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In the face of these very challenging economic and social circumstances, which are compounded by an environment of increased volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, there is an urgent need for the region to conceptualize and reimagine a framework for navigating these turbulent times. In doing so, I invite us to reflect on a similarly challenging period in economic history. In the 1930s, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed a series of projects, programs, financial reforms, and regulatory changes to revitalize his country's economy in the face of the Great Depression. His objective was to spearhead economic recovery, reform the financial system, tackle poverty, and reduce unemployment. President Roosevelt's plan was called the New Deal. And under his leadership, the American people and the US economy gradually rebounded from a period of severe hardship and economic turmoil. As I see it, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, repeated natural hazards, a changing climate, the Russia-Ukraine war, and legacy structural vulnerabilities, if considered jointly, can in fact amount to conditions comparable to that of a Great Depression. Then when you add climate change and the attendant risks to our already precarious position, it creates a veritable tipping point for the region, a tipping point screaming for urgent attention. As a result, although I was asked to speak about supporting the region's post-pandemic recovery, the Caribbean's development challenge is not merely to recover lost ground or to close the gap to achieving some sustainable development goals, but to fundamentally alter our course to place our societies on a higher and more sustainable welfare path in the future. Therefore, The conversation I wish to have with you today is about reimagining a sustainable future. A future showcased through citizens with sustainable livelihoods, a future driven by innovation, enabled by an entrepreneurial culture, and sustained by resilience. To get there, we need to rethink our entire approach to economic development and revisit our obligations to this region that we call home. Our young people have a whole culture around what are called memes. One is particularly instructive when I consider how we should move from the challenges of the present to the future we desire. It says, "No one is coming to save you." My friends, make no mistake, our destiny depends on us. In other words, we have to embrace the maxim that the only way to predict the future is to create it. This starts, therefore, with an unapologetic look in our mirror of introspection to distill our current state and create the vision of the future that we desire. With the vision clear and an acceptance of the challenges that we will need to overcome, we can embrace what I'm calling a process triangle to implement transformation. I refer to three things. One, mapping the investment activities that could drive goals for addressing our challenges. Two, mobilizing appropriate financing for these activities. And three, building implementation capacity. Underpinned with a holistic, integrated development philosophy, underpinned with integrity based on a choice of impeccable governance, and underpinned by strategic partnerships to fill gaps, we can execute transformation. This will require unprecedented commitment from stakeholders at all levels, adhering to measure better to target better, and a share to grow mindset to underpin all of our relationships. Simply put, we, like President Roosevelt and the American people, we will need a new deal. So today, I will share my thoughts on several determining factors that should shape this new accord. As a precursor, permit me to set the stage by summarizing some of our immediate challenges and outline some policy recommendations for consideration, some of which I am sure we would have had in the first 3 days of the RPMS. So first, on policy options that we ought to be considering. The economic performance of the Caribbean economies depend heavily on the economic performance of our main trading partners, owing to our ties through the channels of external demand for goods and services, inward foreign direct investment, imports, and remittances. While we all hoped that the global economy would experience a seamless return to pre-pandemic output levels, our fear of a prolonged and difficult recovery seems to be materializing. In its October 2022 World Economic Outlook, the IMF lowered its global growth forecast to 3.2% in 2022 and 2.7% in 2023. The weakest global growth profile since 2001, except for the global financial crisis of 2008 and the acute phase of the pandemic. So for regional economic managers, these are turbulent economic times to navigate. The convergence of elevated debt levels, weakened fiscal positions, spiraling inflation, and now the prospect of a slowdown in the pace of recovery has created conditions equivalent to a perfect storm, with a few remaining policy levers in most toolboxes. In some countries, monetary authorities are now confronted with the problematic trade-off of taming inflation versus slamming the brakes on an already fragile economic recovery. Let me remind us all that these macroeconomic measures that we have just talked about do not fully describe the social impact and development regression arising from these turbulent times that we are now experiencing. What then should be done in this constrained policy environment while the region waits for global economic growth to revive? First, mindful that before the onset of COVID-19, 1 in 4 Caribbean citizens were considered poor by regional standards, governments must continue to protect the poor and vulnerable households from the high cost of living by increased targeted, although temporary, social protection support, while simultaneously strengthening the overall social protection architecture. Second, boost investments in regional education systems to mitigate the long-term impact of learning loss and structural scars to the region's future human capital stock, productivity, and competitiveness. Third, accelerate the diffusion, dissemination, and adoption of digital technology across the length and breadth of the Caribbean economies for greater digital connectivity and productivity. Fourth, where possible, engage in laser-focused active liability management to create fiscal room through extended debt maturity profiles and more concessional lending terms to secure lower debt service obligations and increased liquidity in the near term. And fifth, provide continued support, liquidity and technical, to the business sector, particularly the micro, small and medium enterprises, contingent on increasing formality, climate resilience, digital upgrading, and assistance to women-owned businesses. Now, while there are no magical solutions, these measures can enable better navigation of the current turbulence. However, even while we rebalance from our present circumstances, we must remain focused on creating the best possible future by the repositioning of our economies and societies. We need, therefore, to effect a suite of policies that can generate both internal coherence today and temporal consistency with long-term goals. Which brings me back to my proposition of a new deal for effecting our self-rescue. So what then are the constituent parts of this new deal? It has 5 pieces. I label 3 of them as foundational and 2 as facilitators. So first, I will discuss the 3 foundational elements, and these are consensus building, resilience, and partnerships. So first, consensus building. I believe that the foundation must be consensus building, specifically aligning on regional commonalities, challenges, and critical policy imperatives. As a reminder, our history shows that no matter how well intended and sensible any regional proposal has been, the absence of consensus ultimately has resulted in its undoing. Hence, the centrality of establishing agreement on the present state and the fate of the region if the current ideological and policy trajectory is maintained will be vitally important in forging this new accord. There are significant points around which we must coalesce as a region, and I am going to refer to those as the Caribbean Commons. So, what are those areas we can agree upon? The first, we live in a hyper-volatile and shock-prone neighborhood, which leaves us highly vulnerable.
Recent work by the IMF points to the fact that of the 511 disasters worldwide to impact small states since 1950, 324 of those were in the Caribbean. And these have resulted in over 250,000 deaths and affecting 24 million through injury and loss of property. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we have endured multiple and varying shocks, ranging from the global financial crisis, hydrometeorological and geological hazards, inclusive of hurricanes, tropical storms, flooding, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions. We've endured the COVID-19 pandemic, a sudden and drastic logistics and terms of trade shock, and now rising commodity prices and stagflation. So given the predominance of multiple, overlapping, and cascading exogenous natural and economic shocks, as well as various structural weaknesses, it is fair to conclude that the region has endured long durations for recovery compared to other developing countries, and that has led to the progressive weakening of the economy's capacity to grow at acceptable rates and to improve, therefore, the living standards of its citizens. As a result, our resilience, which we can define as our capacity to absorb shocks and to continue to grow, our resilience is low. Analytical work undertaken by the CDB has revealed that on average, Caribbean economies took 4 years, and a couple have not recovered up to now, 4 years to recover from the fallout of the global financial crisis, compared to other small island developing states whose GDP remained largely unimpacted. This prolonged recovery duration translates into an accumulation of welfare losses for the region, which slowly erodes hard-won development gains. The third common we need to think through is an unintended consequence of the long cycle of shock and recovery is the incorrect equivalence attributed to economic growth and recovery. The nuanced difference between these often conflated terminologies is that economic recovery refers to returning to pre-shock levels of economic output, while economic growth refers to increasing economic output above and beyond that which existed prior to the occurrence of a shock. So while growth is always welcomed, the region's recent growth performance must be contextualized with its vulnerabilities, its incidence of hazards, and the factors that can contribute to recovery durations. In fact, much of what we refer to as growth in the last 20 years can and should be correctly classified as 2 decades of recovery. Interestingly, COVID-19 laid bare what medical experts have long said. Many Caribbean citizens, due to lifestyle choices, have developed preventable pre-existing conditions which place them at higher risk of death upon contracting the virus. I put it to you similarly, many of our countries' fiscal immune systems were compromised ahead of the pandemic owing to constrained fiscal space, which was exacerbated by economic comorbidities such as high debt, impaired infrastructure, chronic implementation incapacity, and institutional infirmity. In short, we have been living dangerously. Also, it is no secret that our revealed preference is tilted towards a short-term development policy horizon. When interacted with repeat occurrences of exogenous shocks, the end result is a recovery-centric bias. The fundamental problem with this approach is a perilous bifurcation of recovery and resilience, which we can ill afford given our socio-economic constraints. The truth is, embracing short-term quick fixes and narrow recovery strategies, isolated from broader and long-term structural reform itself, contributes to the undermining of our resilience-building efforts. The last common, the cost of development is astronomical. The high-level climate action champions for COP26 and COP27 estimates that at least a 590% increase in annual climate financing is required to mitigate the impact of a warming climate by 2030. The sheer complexity and existential risks associated with climate change and the growth and development convergence consequences if the region delays action or adopts a laissez-faire stance towards transitioning its economies demands resources of unprecedented scale and depth. And there are other urgent priorities as well. We have spoke about food security, water security, energy security, shelter security, education security, and health security. All of those in addition to the 600% increase I talked about to get us to just manage the climate issue. And I think we can say all of those should command a form of national consensus for securing a thriving Caribbean for future generations. So I think those are the commons that we begin with, we need to at least agree on to be able to undertake this mirror of introspection that we can now use to give us the vision that we are looking for. I think the second thing we need to keep through in terms of foundations, separate from the commons, is a resilience paradigmatic shift. At CDB, we believe that vulnerability and resilience are two sides of the sustainable development nexus. Vulnerability can result from a loss of resilience, and resilience can be slowed by changes in vulnerability. While vulnerability summarizes why developing countries are not able to achieve higher potential development, it is unable to capture adequately how shocks increase vulnerability, reduce resilience, increase the duration to recovery, and limit sustainable development. Further, while several countries may face a similar likelihood of a hazard, and therefore similar vulnerabilities, their ability to recover from the shock while preserving the welfare of citizens can differ vastly. And we argue that many of our countries are therefore stuck in the low resilience, high vulnerability quadrant of the development space and need to move to a high resilience, low vulnerability quadrant if we are to undertake transformative development. And so that is the second thing that we need to do. And so as a result of this, we come up with one particular statement, that to achieve sustainable development, we must build a resilience ecosystem. And what we mean by that is development itself is a linked and integrated system, and each of those elements require a type of resilience, and those resilience elements are themselves linked. And therefore, if we have to have an economic ecosystem, we must have a resilience ecosystem to allow the economic system to remain sustainable and stable. There is a growing understanding that resilience is complex and multidimensional. We therefore need a sustainable transformation agenda at the regional level that is focused on building the 5 following resilience dimensions that we think are reasonably comprehensive in scope. First, social resilience, which is to maintain social advancement by creating health and learning networks and leveraging digital technology. We need productive capacity resilience, which is to widen and deepen economic diversification by advancing digitalization and leveraging knowledge creation to promote what we are also labeling the industrialization of knowledge. Third, we need environmental resilience, and that is no secret. I think everyone is focused on environmental resilience today. It's mitigating and adapting to climate change and addressing the undiversified energy base to promote sustainable energy and sustainable livelihoods in the region. Fourth, we need institutional resilience, improving governance and implementation capacity through modernizing the business environment and procurement arrangements, implementing new technology and knowledge processes, strengthening public bodies and planning processes, and enhancing delivery mechanisms. And fifth, we need financing resilience, which is to develop and marshal a financing ecosystem that encompasses a wide spectrum of innovative and affordable financing instruments that are underpinned by a strong regulatory environment and a well-developed financial market infrastructure. So that's the broad concept of resilience that we need to take into space, together with the consensus building of the commons that I spoke of. And the third element of the foundation that we need is partnerships. And so we need partnerships in development. Invariably, we, the Caribbean people, face common challenges. And therefore, a critical imperative of this New Deal is developing partnerships for collective action to support broad-based economic development and enhance resilience in our region. I think we all agree we must act now, and we will achieve more if we act together. This principle of global cooperation was a valuable lesson from COVID-19. It is well aligned with the African Ubuntu philosophy about how things are interconnected. It is sometimes translated as "I am because we are," and emphasizes the value in the ability to work together towards a common goal. So we need partnerships among ourselves. We need partnerships between the public and the private sector. We need partnerships with external stakeholders, and I think we've mentioned a couple of those already yesterday. We need partnerships on knowledge creation and sharing. And we need partnerships in activities, partnerships in financing, and partnerships in capacity building. All of those are going to be important, but I want to highlight a couple. First, central banks. While central banks routinely partner in combating and neutralizing financial crises and restoring financial stability, the existential threat of climate change has necessitated that central banks join their regional and national development bank counterparts in implementing green central banking. This would involve taking environmental risk and other sustainability-related factors, such as climate change mitigation policy, into account in the design of monetary policy and financial regulation, in the pursuit of price and financial stability, or to promote green investment or discourage brown investment. This will help to direct investment away from carbon and resource-intensive activity and help accelerate progress towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. There is also need for a different type of partnership between the private and the public sectors. By this, I mean a partnership for development aimed at reducing policy uncertainty, advocating transparency, and enhancing implementation capacity throughout the project cycle from inception to evaluation, not the PPPs that we are accustomed to now of PPPs where the private sectors are residual financiers. This positioning of development at the heart of business strategy can forge mission-oriented activities, can galvanize complementarities, and build trust for joint prosperity. Conventional thinking sees the private sector as an adjunct to the social and economic development process, with the liberty to opt in or out. To be clear, development in our mind has to be a shared responsibility, one where individual stakeholder egos are subordinated through the notion that development of the whole will always imply development for all. Indeed, we can argue profitability and development are not incompatible. Rather, private enterprise should apply the ingenuity, the innovation, entrepreneurial drive, and goal-oriented approach employed in commercial pursuits to national and regional development objectives. Let me therefore invite you to reimagine PPP. What prevents us from reframing PPP as partnerships for prosperity and profits? When you drill down on the areas of focus and anticipated impacts of the Sustainable Development Agenda, they speak in our mind to the very heart of business objectives. Programs, for example, that enhance education and improve skills development will create a knowledge-oriented workforce with the extensive skill base necessary for industries of the future. That, my friends, is sustainability. When we target health, energy security, water security, and food and nutrition security, it is to improve living conditions and enhance the well-being of our populations, allowing the people of the Caribbean to realize their full potential, which will lead to stable and resilient economies and societies. Therefore, that will attract investment and foster business growth. Consequently, sustainable economies are therefore the sine qua non of sustainable businesses. And therefore, it is incumbent on private sector to see development not as somebody else's business, but as their business, as a means of sustaining the very businesses that they are looking to promote. Beyond the three foundations that I've spoken about, building consensus, resilience, and partnerships, our New Deal needs well-articulated facilitators, and I want to focus on two: technology and innovation, and finance. So first, technology and innovation. A key lesson from COVID-19 is that technology is not only crucial for long-term economic growth and productivity, but it is also a resilience tool that can be used to mitigate the impact of exogenous shocks and foster quicker recoveries. This suggests that the region should leverage technology as part of its resilience toolkit. Admittedly, the financial sector has been in the vanguard of technological adoption, particularly with the fintech and e-commerce space. In fact, 3 of our region's monetary authorities, Bahamas, Jamaica, and the OECS, have already taken bold steps to introduce digital currencies, and that we should applaud as being at the forefront. Since assuming the presidency of the bank, I have also highlighted the nexus between long-term growth and a country's capacity to innovate. I have suggested recasting Sir Arthur Lewis's development with unlimited supplies of labor model by replacing labor with embodied knowledge and focusing on the unbounded and unlimited knowledge that the Caribbean possesses as input to attain resilient economic growth and development, so that we move from unlimited supplies of labor to infinite source and supply of knowledge. This augmentation of Lewis's model is a recognition of the primacy of a nation's capacity to produce and to use knowledge as the differentiating factor that could dictate the pace of development and the rate of convergence with more advanced economies. The roles of technology and innovation are captured in the trade-to-growth nexus. Global trade, however, has focused inordinately on trade in goods and the theory of comparative advantage, minimizing the value of technology and the value of intellectual property. So the New Deal that I referred to sees trade as rooted in knowledge creation, the process of accumulating, discovering, and strategically transforming, a process that is driven by innovation, entrepreneurship, and technological sophistication. Through this industrialization of knowledge, as opposed to industrialization of product, we can transform information into knowledge for the creation of intellectual assets. When underpinned with technology, these intellectual assets have the potential to create a competitive and comparative advantage that in conventional growth theory would be impossible due to our small size and limited natural resources. In short, therefore, industrializing knowledge provides a means by which small and medium economies like ours can create products, markets, and industries that can drive agility while promoting economic diversification. This, my friends, will require establishing a governance framework that allows developing economies to compete internationally in knowledge-based industries. In the Caribbean, intellectual property frameworks would have to evolve into more balanced, coherent, relevant, and responsive structures to be fit for purpose in the global environment. We must institute greater provisions under our patent laws to address both economic and humanitarian needs. Correspondingly, international trade agreements should ensure rightful remuneration for intellectual assets and artistic works from international markets. Likewise, connectivity will become an important element of the trade development nexus that we are talking about. And we refer to three types of connectivity that need to be addressed. First, digital connectivity must be leveraged to strengthen capacity and create modernized trade systems to ensure that our countries can competitively and effectively engage trading partners. Therefore, as a matter of priority, we need greater investment to upgrade ICT infrastructure and expand access to quality broadband services while creating an enabling environment and strengthening the digital skills of our people. Even as we look to grow industries through digital commerce, we cannot lose sight of physical connectivity. Transference by land, sea, and air remain vital to capturing and expanding market access for many traditional industries. Consequently, investment is required to reduce the fragmentation that impedes our logistics networks and to enhance road, air, and sea and transportation infrastructure. And third, there is cultural connectivity. For us in the Caribbean, this is about our history and heritage that have created unique cultures that provide distinctive output and unforgettable experiences through art, literature, and music. So broadening the discourse on trade to include these areas will allow our region to monetize those innate factors and expand commercial activity offering income generation opportunities for marginalized groups, including indigenous peoples and economically challenged but culturally fertile communities. And a key to developing cultural connectivity is communication capacity. And that is the need for investment in promoting and sustaining cultural assets and promoting and executing multi-language capacity so that we can leverage the unlimited boundaries provided by digital technology. And we can see how this can occur if every school child graduating at the secondary level would have fluency in all of the 5 languages spoken in the region. And what if our universities, and I understand UWI is about to start this now, or has just started, what if our universities would teach every profession, have 1 course or 2 capstone courses in at least 2 languages, so that by the time you graduate, you become multilingual in a professional way. And just think of what that might mean in utilizing digital technology for promotion, for work, for engaging in the entire global space. These are some of the things we need to begin to embrace if we are to think about a tomorrow that is going to be different. And then the third element, which rounds off the facilitator, second facilitator I spoke of, next to innovation and technology, is a finance. And we talk about a financing ecosystem. At the same time, and before we can speak about opportunities for enterprise and investment, we must recognize the need for access to sources of financing. And I think all of you understand this as central bank governors. You cannot undertake any activity in our modern economies without finance. And so all the activities we spoke of can only be delivered if we have access to finance. So we at CDB have proposed to establish a multi-sourced, multi-instrument financing ecosystem with a suite of instruments to address various needs, ranging from emergency financing to longer-term fiscal goals. This adroit framework must, of course, be underpinned by the appropriate governance and regulatory systems. And we have called on the central bank governors to partner and work with us in the spirit of the region to deliver on that very promise of a financing ecosystem. The instruments would include all of the typical instruments we know of. So bonds, designed to propel sustainability and initiatives in the green, blue, and orange economies and the cultural and creative industries. Private equity, to drive new enterprises. Yesterday, we spoke about contingent debt instruments to manage uncertainty, derivative-based instruments to manage risk, and concessional funding to lower the cost of funding. The instruments must be designed to allow use with a purpose and have terms that can be customized to distinguish financing for rescue, financing for recovery, and financing for repositioning. Because I think we'll all agree the terms of financing for rescue cannot be the same terms for financing for recovery operations, cannot be the same terms for financing for repositioning long-term investments. As I have repeatedly stated, the level of support needed will not come from traditional sources. So this presents opportunities for innovative instruments, creative partnerships, and novel approaches to marshalling resources for development. Imagine if we could harness the capacity of the pension funds, pool monetary resources across the region, or attract institutional investors. What prevents us from devising business and investment initiatives that propel sustainable development and bring a return on investment that is sufficient to secure funding from global donor organizations or private financiers? What about reimagining desired reductions in premium cost of funds as the price of implementing activities that build resilience and therefore enhance sustainability? Can we maturate the concept of return on investment to sustainable return on investment? We can ask, is it better to have high nominal returns for a short period than to have lower nominal returns over a sustained period? And should the concept of return not include externalities from achieving sustainability in development? I propose to you that these are some of the questions we need to ask, some of the ideas we need to propose if we are to change the landscape going forward. And equally to state, our only limitations, I believe, lie in a failure to recognize and utilize our limited creativity and ingenuity. And therefore, as we look forward to tomorrow, it is that ingenuity of our people that will allow us to do what I said at the beginning, not hope for the future, but create our tomorrow. It is my firmly held view that our best hope of rising to our present and future development challenges is the systematic integration of the debt sustainability framework of the International Monetary Fund with the investment growth nexus of the World Bank and the SDG resilience building framework of the United Nations. Equally, we need to address both the financing gap and the mounting fiscal pressures that will require decisive action to ensure domestic finance goes further and faster. Hence, I'd like to suggest a few additional elements for consideration. One, deepening and broadening of the regional financial systems to enhance access to slow exit, longer-term financing, the widening of the investor base, and mitigating exchange rate depreciation risk associated with external debt. That, I think, is an urgent priority that we should be wrapping our heads around. Although the Caribbean's financial sector has played an indispensable role in supporting regional economic progress thus far, we need to create financial markets that will facilitate intra- and inter-Caribbean flow of capital aimed not at speculative investments, but geared towards equity investment and private expansion. The second idea we need to embrace is to incentivize and accelerate the mobilization of all financing resources, domestic, bilateral, and multilateral, towards attaining the region's sustainable development goals, so financing with a purpose. This will require reorienting public investment management ecosystems towards an SDG and climate resilience focus, and will require the enhancing of data and statistical systems to capture such data and to periodically report progress in key SDG indicators. Third, is strengthening of public financial management and expenditure ecosystems to ensure value for money and to minimize wastage. To ensure public financial management systems are fit for the future, we will need continued focus to be placed on improving transparency and accountability of government spending, improving the linkages between government strategic plans and the allocation of resources, increasing the use of risk management tools to improve the resilience of state-owned enterprises, implementing accrual-based accounting in government to provide more comprehensive financial information to support decision-making, and improving transparency in procurement through the introduction of e-procurement systems. Fourth, we need to prioritize macro fiscal stability as a key pathway to accessing increased financial resources at more concessional terms. With strong macroeconomic fundamentals, countries are likely to receive favorable credit rating scores, which will translate into lower risk pricing of sovereign debt, as well as enhancing the ability of CDB and other institutions to mobilize resources on international markets. Fifth, regionally, we should support the rechanneling of unused special drawing rights resources to assist Caribbean countries develop resilience. The channeling of SDRs would provide opportunities to reposition and transform the region's economies by increasing leverage of those resources, by deploying a wider range of financing products, promoting a holistic yet targeted approach to inclusive social and economic development, and making effective use of regional sector expertise. Governors, ladies and gentlemen, I hope my words today will spark a sense of urgency. Time is against us. And while we cannot foresee or predict the next big upheaval that is what we seem to have all the time, we can prepare for it, and we can do this in one way, by building resilient businesses, resilient institutions, resilient social systems, and resilient economies. This will only be achieved, we believe, through collaborative endeavors, where governments, development finance institutions, and the private sector can engage as development partners. To facilitate this, there must be the process triangle that I spoke of, encompassing viable projects, plus adequate and affordable finance, and an effective implementation apparatus, characterized by strong governance and appropriate regulatory frameworks. This combination, we believe, will engender the confidence that is critical for a development partnership to occur. And CDB, in closing, stands ready to lead or facilitate this collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jean Leon. As you spoke on the supporting the Caribbean's region post-pandemic recovery, you covered many important points. You covered the maxim of creating the future by imagining it, and you spoke of the viable triangle. You obviously discussed the weaknesses we face now and the challenges we face in our current economy, but you proposed a number of very key ideas in terms of how these economies can derive long-term growth and development. You spoke of the 3 foundational as well as 2 conditional conditions of such a policy. Many of the points covered issues of consensus building, resilience, partnership, facilitating growth, reimagining models that have been in place for the past 70 years in terms of the Sir Arthur Lewis model of infinite embedded knowledge, and also broadening financial systems as well as strengthening the public systems through the use of many key tools and measures. At this point in time, we're going to open the floor for comments, and I ask that you kindly identify yourself as you ask Dr. Jean questions on his presentation or related areas. So we can start. We have time for comments, questions. have a question at the back or a comment? Could you kindly identify yourself? There's a mic. There's a mic coming. So, we'll, go ahead, please.
I found a lot of the information that you spoke about very useful. So grateful for that, particularly the part on PPPs, which is something that we always talk about. I'd really like to find out from you, though, your view on how to get more countries within our region to really consider the value of PPP and really taking it on board in many different areas. I know you spoke about education, healthcare, but what other areas do you see the PPP model being most useful? And again, how can it be more widely adopted?
First, on the more widely adopted part, I think it has to be viewed as a no-choice option. The model of governments leading, the model of governments driving, the entirety of development is just no longer possible. There isn't the room, there isn't the space, and even if they had room and space, the needs are just far too much to actually even contemplate governments doing it. So the idea of the PPP, and I say it in the reverse, not the public-private partnership, because there's a mindset already about public-private partnership, but partnerships between the public and the private sector is one where the leader and follower adopt a position of equality in responsibility. And so the focus is not on government's position, but nationally agreed, hence the need for the consensus, nationally agreed meta objectives that will guide everyone. And in guiding everyone, I mean the private sector will see and have the means to actually want to engage in all those activities that will get to the objectives that we are talking about, while they still do what they do best, using their ingenuity to make profits. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it is one of complementarities. And it is how do we forge that complementarity into a national deal. And so if, for example, we think of education as something that is important for the future of the region, not only in the next 5 years, because for sure meta objectives have to transcribe and transcend political electoral cycles. It's not about 5-year, 10-year goals. It's really long-term. If you start with this as your education, just think first, what does that mean? It has to be sufficiently broad in education, not just learning, delivery, object. It has to involve learning of people, values, what constitutes the education, the psyche of the nation. And if you define that as the goal that you're looking to do, and all political parties agree that that is something everyone will follow, you eliminate the policy uncertainty that exists and prevents the private sector from wanting to undertake those activities, and therefore provides the room for the private sector to internalize that there is room for them to enter and invest in education activities, not necessarily the school, but education activities broadly defined, because when they do that, they end up with a workforce
that can now be an input into their own ability to make money by creating activity. So they would, in essence, see, I think, the reason, the rationale, the means for investment and not have to wait on government. Now, governments would need to do other things, certain regulatory facilitating environments such that together you can have that initiative where private sector can initiate certain ideas. Let's just think how often we've heard of students graduating and they are not yet fit for what the private sector wants. Now that's a misalignment that private sectors can, if they are forward-looking in thinking and know where they intend to go over the next 20, 30 years based upon global trends, business opportunities, they might want to see room to engineer educational learning opportunities in certain areas that would automatically map, and they would fund that because it's a natural cost and investment which is an input for what they would need to make their businesses thrive. And the two examples I gave in my presentation was to square that circle by showing investing in what we call development is equivalent to providing the means for sustaining businesses. And so the business sector should, in fact, see their sustainability as being dependent upon the success of the very development that we are talking about. And if there is no policy uncertainty and adequate long-term goals, there's nothing that prevents the private sector, in my mind, from wanting to be able to get there. And so if we see this as a partnership, and we see it as development, as a joint responsibility, I equally believe there is not going to be that much difficulty in having governments and the private sector see their roles independently and jointly as a means of effecting development, because it will be for the betterment of everyone. It's a very different way of looking at the world, but that's what I'm here to try to do, is to help shift the thinking, help turn it on its head, not to necessarily accept it, but to challenge it. That way we can see what can we do differently, how can we approach tomorrow's world differently if we are to make a difference, a real difference in our opportunities to put ourselves on a different trajectory, on a different path.
Thank you very much. And if I may, you can just indulge me with a follow-up question. And that one is, apart from education and healthcare, what do you see as other areas that may be low-hanging fruit where there would be useful PPPs to look at?
Well, I think useful PPPs, for me, in my definition, is it can span the entire development space. We said 6 things we believe are urgent: food security, water security, energy security, shelter security, education security, health security. So we spoke of education. What about health? Why can't we think about, to begin with, a health system whereby the goal becomes universal health insurance coverage for every citizen in the region? So we might say, okay, that's not possible. It's not possible if we think that it has to be done by government. But the moment you start to think, what do I need? I need, first of all, a roster, a register of all medical providers. Then I need to use technology, digital technology, to link all of them in one network. I need to be able to invest in, let's say, digital diagnostic tools, such that anybody that falls sick in any country can immediately use the technology, the digital space, to get an immediate pre-screening that can be uploaded through the same digital technology to one of the medical professionals, practitioners across the entire space. Now, once they've done that, obviously you would need to have a series of establishments, centers of excellence. Some can be in radiography, some can be in surgery in a different way. But what if you can locate those across the entire region? And whoever it is that falls sick will have the ability, once they've been pre-screened, to actually now be in a position to get medical treatment in their specialty in any space within the region. For that to happen, you would need to have transportation to be able to move people in and out in exactly the same way. You would need to be able to have access to all of the equipment, all of the skills, maintaining. That is all taking place here. There can be equally convalescent areas that would exist and be part of that very health ecosystem that we are talking about. And it can all be paid by people purchasing insurance, companies providing insurance, or governments providing for the most needy and vulnerable. But you can finance it. But notice I have not said anything here about governments doing. These all become opportunities as long as I set the idea, an accepted national idea, that our goal in the next 30 years is medical coverage for every citizen, wherever you are in the region. Now, once I get there, I can start thinking, if I am an entrepreneur, if I am a private sector person, what are the elements, the services I can provide and I can do for profit that can actually make this happen? But in spite of all of the many spokes that I have just put in that can come off that one idea, what you do need is the vision has to be sufficiently well articulated that you don't run into the problem of no one wants to move first because they are afraid it might flop, or they are afraid the policy may not sustain itself. And so it is that need for the consensus of what is beyond party, what is beyond national, that will now anchor you. And then the vision has to be sufficiently clear where you are going, how you are going, what is the rubric, the processes that we are looking at, and then the opportunities present themselves, and people will automatically come in. So that's what I talk about in terms of a partnership between the public and the private sector. And so the opportunities will spontaneously arise. It is not about peaking, because peaking presupposes that you want to do something that you've determined already. And if you've determined it, then how does the private sector originate an idea that would satisfy their room to want to be able to grow spontaneously as a business? So it is creating the concept, creating the idea, creating the environment, and then I think it will all be spontaneous because the opportunities can be there. And I came up with so many just on the fly. And we can do this in shelter. We can do it in water, in renewable energy. It's just a matter of getting the ideas there, the consensus, the environment, and changing our mindsets. That becomes extremely, extremely important.
Dr. Leon, this is really a wonderful lecture. You talk about the multi-source of financing, and you mentioned clearly financing for rescue, financing for development, financing for resilience, and so on. My question is that, how do you see the role of CDB in that new vision for the future?
Yeah, and as I said, that's an area that we are looking at. We have started thinking about. The idea is, how do we create a financing ecosystem? And that financing ecosystem cannot be done by CDB alone, because a financing ecosystem requires not only the sourcing of finance, and there are many buckets, but the design and deployment of the multiplicity of instruments, and then the environment within which they are deployed. And if you recall at our previous meeting with the governors when we had our initial conversation on this, you cannot divorce that financing ecosystem from the payments and the settlement mechanisms that exist that you control. And so there has to be a partnership, because it cannot be we are tugging at odds with each other. And so our role here becomes A, in the thought leadership side, B, in the convening power side, 3, in the mobilization of funding sources side, and working in partnership with all the elements that will allow the ecosystem to thrive and thrive going forward.
There seems to be no other questions at this moment. Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, and that was a wonderful lecture indeed, and the questions were on point. We're slightly ahead of schedule. We're about 10 minutes before the closing of the session, but I'd like to thank Dr. Leon from Caribbean Development Bank for such an insightful thought in terms of his presentation this morning, supporting the post-pandemic recovery within the Caribbean and the region throughout. I understand the presentation will be available for all individuals. It will be shared among all the governors. Thank you again.
Good morning, governors. We will resume at 10:50. So thank you.